And now I have the pleasure of introducing Luke Stelle as a Cultural Affairs Officer of the U.S. Embassy in Santo Domingo, who's going to give us an introduction to this event.
Great, thank you so much, Alejandra. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the U.S. Embassy in Santo Domingo, I am very pleased to welcome you to the second webinar of our higher education series. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you to explore the topic of virtual exchange. Promoting access to high quality education is one of our key embassy priorities. As many of you will remember, several of you that are here listening in November of 2019, we held the Florida Dominican Republic Higher Education Summit to bring together higher education representatives from the Dominican Republic with their counterparts from the state of Florida. Dr. Heidi Powell was one of the Florida higher education representatives that participated and led a very well-received presentation. I'm very happy that Dr. Heidi Powell has returned to share another innovative presentation, and that she has brought along Dr. Joana Hyatt from the University of Florida. Thank you also to Fulbright alumna Alejandra Matos, who is serving today as moderator for this discussion. And just again, I wanted to thank all three of you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. It really means a lot to the embassy that you're willing to take the time to do this. And we appreciate that all the relationships that you've made in the past, that you want to see those go forward in the future. So I look forward to hearing what questions our virtual audience has for our panelists today. So everyone start thinking what you want to ask our panelists. And I'm very excited to see what additional opportunities for collaboration emerge from this webinar series. So thank you all again. Y estamos unidos.
Thank you, Luke, for that introduction. So now I have the absolute pleasure of introducing both our panelists today. First of all, I have Dr. Heidi Powell. She is the Director of Masters of Arts in Education, in Art Education Online at the University of Florida. But before I continue with her presentation, because I want all of you to hear how wonderful her work has been, I would just like to know that if the interpretation audio is coming in clearly and in a volume that is understandable. So if like any of the participants could write on the chat box that are using the interpretation, if they are listening to us clearly today. You could just share with us, how is the audio quality? Okay, so we're getting excellent, that the interpretation can be listened to, but the volume is still a little bit low. Okay, so our team is working on it. Thank you everyone for your patience today. So I'm gonna go back to Dr. Heidi's bio. Dr. Heidi Powell is an artist and scholar of Native American, Delenni Lenape, and Norwegian descent, and currently serves as the director of the MA in Art Education online program at the University of Florida in the College of the Arts, and recently spoke on the arts as part of the DRFL Higher Education Summit. As part of her research and practice, she explores cultural positioning in arts pedagogy. Her work focuses on indigenous and isolated histories and the relationship to contemporary society as a landscape. Foundational to her work is the notion of story, re-emphasizing the conflictual and the consensual in society. She says, art making is a way of adding original dialogue and new ideas, narratives of knowledge that demonstrate how individual truth, imagination, and experience work together. Heidi has served as an NEH Fellow to Alaska and the Northwest Coast, a Fulbright Scholar to Iceland, a Jewish National Fund Fellow, and has numerous accolades in her field. One of her most recent publications is a visual essay in the International Journal of Education Through Art titled Alfombras, Creative Acts of Cultural Memory in Art Education. So thank you, Dr. Powell, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Then we have Dr. Joana Hyatt, which is an adjunct assistant professor of the online Master of Arts in Art Education at the University of Florida. Dr. Hyatt is the assistant professor of art education at Lamar University, where she instructs pre-service art educators and supervises student teachers. Additionally, Joana teaches graduate courses online for the University of Florida. Dr. Hyatt's teaching practices and research emphasizes the visualization of liminal spaces, which illustrates the vulnerable conditions of working teachers and artists as they mediate the convergence of space, place, and identity within the permeable boundaries of institutional heterotopias. Her research methodologies include art-based inquiry, narrative inquiry, critical pedagogy, and ethnography. Dr. Hyatt has published in national and international journals. Currently, Joana serves as the chair of the PLR working group under the NAEA Research Commission and on the editorial review board of Art Education, the Journal of the National Art Education Association. Thank you, Dr. Hyatt, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So I'll go ahead and put up our PowerPoint here. And I'd like to just thank you for having us. And Joana and myself, we often collaborate together, so that's why I've invited her here with me. We are collaborative partners and many other things within the domain of art education. I think what we're sharing today more so is about virtual exchange than art education, and how virtual exchange and the concepts that we use in art education can actually broadly be implemented to other disciplines and other domains. So I want to go ahead and let me see here. There we go. So first, I really would like to talk to you about what is virtual exchange. We're going to start out sharing about virtual exchange first, and then shift into this concept called piggybacking. And it's a more specific type of exchange that lends itself to immersive cultural learning and is faculty or teacher-led, but really student-driven. So, but before we get to the piggybacking, it's really good and important to understand what virtual exchange is. Virtual exchange is a practice supported by research. Intent does a lot of work. If you want to know more about that and what they're doing, it's really exciting. It originally started kind of for language learning originally as far as VE goes, and it's often used in language structure. We actually repositioned it for art education and making art as a language. A teaching and learning, it's also a teaching and learning paradigm that promotes the development of intercultural competence and really shared across multicultural learning environments. We had the real fortune of working with two academics. It's Gosia Carrick and the other is Karine Ulam. They shared a lot of information with us, which was really exciting. It's also a curricular structure for education. It's technology-based learning where interaction and communication take place between individuals or groups. And often these individual or groups are geographically separate and also from other cultural backgrounds. So there's a lot of layering to this and how you choose to adapt it. And I'm going to show you different ways that we've chosen to adapt it. It is also organized and facilitated by educators or academic facilitators usually, but anyone can do it. And it's a mode that combines deep impact of intercultural dialogue and exchange with a broad reach of digital technology. And I think that's what makes it really special. We're going to talk about not only the components of VE, but we're also going to share about kind of everyday technology that we get to use in virtual exchange and piggybacking. So I really want to kind of give you a quick history of Joana and I so you understand how piggybacking got developed and how we really exchange information and ideas to really grow processes. So for us, it began informally. We began chronicling our experiences abroad and comparing them. We began to travel with each other and engaged as partners and colleagues. And one such example of that is Joana and I went to Paris to present at the University of Paris. And I've lived a lot of places abroad. And so I was looking at Paris from a local perspective. And Joana was looking at Paris through a tourist paradigm. And so we really began to compare these ideas and what it meant. So we began talking about what does exchange mean, what does cultural exchange mean, and how can we foster global identities and really get, especially our students, kind of understanding global perspectives. So we took this VE workshop. It was sponsored by the UF's International Center. And Joana and I Joana in a minute, she'll discuss the takeaways from that workshop in the next slide. But we designed a course ourselves where I would be in Israel with grad students and Joana would be with undergraduate students face-to-face at Lamar University. And it was an arts-based course focused on art cultures specific to the geographic region. And we planned that we would engage Joana's group while they were in class on their regular time, in meeting time. And then the grad students and myself would log in from where we were in Israel, and we would jointly experience culture, art, and then afterwards, there would be prompts assigned, and the grad students and the undergrads would have these, what we would call intercultural dialogues. I think what was unique about the way we designed this particular virtual exchange was that that everyone was American and we were engaging in global dialogues from two different vantage points in two different locations. So as we move forward and Joana shares, I really wanted her to come and share because she led me or helped lead me to these discoveries of how I wanted to approach VE for myself in online learning and as the director of online education. So we often just share and have dialogue and compare notes, which grows both our practices. So I'm going to turn it over to Joana to share kind of these takeaways from our virtual exchange course.
Thank you, Heidi. It is an honor to be with you today and the group. As Dr. Powell was explaining, before virtual exchange, as an online instructor, I typically designed my courses around the cognitive domains of Bloom's taxonomy. And so most educators are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. So there are typically 5 application level objectives. And those are remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, and evaluating. In online classes, educators often scaffold learning along these 5 very basic objectives. And what we do, or what we did, is assume that when a student does a task, that's the end of understanding that task. So in other words, if students see it, do it, and submit it, that was the ending for understanding that particular task. Well, after virtual exchange, and I went through that training with Dr. Powell, it really changed my perspective about online learning. Virtual exchange is dynamic. It's always in flux. And it's like creating a story together in process. And so it's really engaging for the students. It's very agentive. It's also based on hybrid learning environments. So virtual exchange really leans more towards adaptive learning. And that causes the student and the instructor to embrace the nuances and ambiguity of teaching and living. So that includes all the strange chaos that happens when we're in class together and when learning is happening, just like technical difficulties and other things. I mean, that's just about, what VE is about. And it's about embracing that and talking about it and working through those kinds of issues. What I love about VE is it creates learning and educational opportunities for students from all backgrounds. So VE actually works against standardization. So VE aims for the fullest inclusion possible by considering different languages, cultural norms, time zones, various technologies, and learning environments. And like Heidi mentioned before, we were in the class together, and we created a unit that was based on the 5 pillars of virtual exchange. And those are having an ethical mindset when learning from other cultures, encouraging communication, creativity, and choice, sharing pedagogical knowledge with each other, and that means teachers and students.
Eso significa docentes y estudiantes. Ser tanto facilitador y uno que aprende, facilitarte y ser también una persona que aprende.
Instruct as well. It also, most importantly, is about promoting digital citizenship and responsibility. So as online instructors of learning, Heidi and I came together and we understood, you know, we must be much more inclusive in our teaching. We need to embrace the idea that all learners will not reach the same outcomes, no matter their backgrounds or intersectionality. Therefore, we need to be creating more open frameworks that are much more nuanced and yet also very complex. And we do that by redefining our learning objectives and outcomes as something that's collaborative, fluid, and emergent. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Dr. Powell.
Dr. Powell, you're muted, sorry.
Sorry, my fault. You can see all the wonderful things that Joanna and I learned from our workshop. And after we took the workshop, it was really interesting because we could finally put names to certain things that we've been doing, and that was really exciting. And then we really realized what we were already doing through not only video communication, but technology itself. The best part for me was to realize and to begin to name my own processes outside of VE that were in addition to VE, and how I was teaching with technology in real time across cultures. One of the things that Joanna mentioned earlier on is that, and we reiterate this quite frequently.
Con mucha frecuencia, el intercambio virtual se inclina más hacia el aprendizaje adaptativo y abrazando las novedades.
Nuanced in story and allowing students to tell their stories of learning and reiterating it back to us. So we really talked about, we often talk about and focus on those types of things. Jerome Bruner, a theorist, used to say all the time, we remember things 2 ways. We remember things because of story, and we remember things because of argument. So we really want to remember things through story. We don't want to have to argue about it. So, and then I'm going to tell you about how I started piggybacking. For me, piggybacking is a term I coined for a specific process and a learning strategy related to the bigger umbrella of virtual exchange. Piggybacking in VE refers to when a person tags along with another person on a virtual platform in education or learning context who doesn't have access or entry into another area or place that someone else does, and they go with them virtually. In this case, it's a virtual process where we're taking students on learning experiences and in real time, and either leading individually or as a group with students who are on site, who are on site, and a piggybacker joins them. And usually it's a site abroad. So how did piggybacking get started for me? Sorry, did it mute back?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry so much. Sorry. Anyway, so the first time I really, I didn't name it piggyback back then, but it was when technology was just emerging. And I was using, not FaceTime, Skype to engage with my students in 2010. I had spent a good amount of time as a Fulbright scholar in Iceland, and ended up curating an exhibition for all the artists that I worked with in Iceland. And we exhibited it in the gallery at the university at that time that I worked at. One of the really cool things is that I got to take my students through the gallery, and on the other end of the Skype line would be the artists. They would either join in 1, 2, or groups where students could actually engage in asking questions. This exhibition at the time was called Flown In, and it was from artists from a place called Estados. And so that was kind of the first foray into me using technology to create across culture and across geography. And so it was a really exciting time. The students got to be specific with the artists themselves as opposed to rely on me for information that I wasn't sure about. Sorry, I have to look at my notes here really quick. So fast forward to the present. After my initial engagement with Skype as a learning tool that crossed cultures and time zones to connect people, I've now developed it more concretely as a learning tool embedded in our VE framework that merges people, places, time, and project-based learning. Antigua Guatemala has been one of my research bases for the past 5 years, engaging students in cultural continuity through arts practice by making alfombras and contributing to the community by joining them in alfombra making. Alfombras are carpets made out of sawdust that specifically relate to the history of Antigua and colonial occupation. My students, both on-site and remotely, participated in the making of alfombras as project-based learning, and at the same time, they learned about the creative cultural practices of Guatemala, and more specifically, Antigua. So I have to confess too that the bottom slide with my group is not the slide that was watching at that time when we were creating, or not the actual students that were watching at that time, but I wanted to give you a perspective of what it looked like when they join in watching while we use Zoom on a cell phone. And I think that's also a key, is that we're using cell phones as readily available technology to piggyback with. So, so my students both on-site and remotely participated in making the alfombras as project-based learning, and they were on-site getting feedback and questions and having conversations about the processes in intermittent designated time. So they were actually able to engage with the process of making. Now, some of them wished they could have been there, but they weren't able to leave either their homes. They didn't have babysitters. They didn't have certain access to be able to leave and come down to Guatemala with some of the other students. So there was this kind of, I don't want to call it a divide, but it was a collaborative divide that really was remedied through synchronous piggybacking with certain students. So again, this slide is the students making an alfombra at a local museum in Antigua. It's called Tradiciones de Semana Santa, and it's a history museum. And this particular alfombra was for an exhibition. And as shown in the pictures, the students can join in as a group or individually, depending on how you choose to create the engagement frameworks. It can be something as simple as one remote group of students participating through one device, or a smaller group or individual students being hosted by other on-site students. And I'm going to show you what that kind of looks like here. What makes piggybacking so successful is that you use, again, the smartphone. It's an everyday way of connecting with people, and often we used WhatsApp or WeChat to do that. Whether they're one-on-one. So I'm going to tell you about the example here in the first picture with the flowers and the students in the street. That's one small group of students joined by remote students without the instructor exploring the streets of Antigua. This is based on the choices of the host on-site students taking the remote students where they want to go. So we have, as the instructor, we have no way of just saying where they want to go. We could have given them a map, but I just allow the students to lead and let it be student driven and see what they discover in the process. And this is actually after they created the alfombra in the museo and before they were creating an alfombra for the community in the streets for the procession. The second one is an example where they're shaking sawdust. It's a remote group viewing an activity that was on site in preparation for making the big alfombra in the streets. where the discussion of process, questions, and conversation about the creative process can be had while also learning about the culture. So the students can jump in and ask those questions. And then the one about the one student, so I have the museum alfombra here. Oftentimes too, you can pair one-on-one students that have specific project or instructional objectives to work through, one being a piggybacker and one being on site. And so in this case, they were looking at alfombras and how alfombras are created for a temporary installation within the context of the museum. So that was one kind of way of looking at it. In China, it's a little bit different because in China, what we had, when I taught in China, I was there at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, teaching as a special appointed scholar for art. They don't typically have art in that university. In piggybacking here, it was local to local. So a student had to follow a student for 30 minutes, piggybacking with them on their everyday journey. And then the piggybacker had to draw a map of how they think it looked when they were going through. So you see, they're looking above, the person who is going on their daily journey is taking them above to this kind of thing to look at the coffee store that they're in, and they're gonna go get coffee as part of their morning route. And then the piggybacker has to actually kind of decide how they're going to illustrate this 30-minute journey. So they're learning about others, their team, people who are actually in class with them, and they're also learning about each other in process. This is a local to local piggyback. And it was very fun. And then they actually had to, what we call mini walk the journey. So they had to walk the journey in the classroom for each other and to see what it looked like. It was active, it was engaged. They also had to look at things like, you know, what do you do differently than what I do? Where do you live versus where do I live? And in particular, the actual university itself was in the Haitian district of China. And so many of the students didn't come from that part of China. So they came from southern China or other places. And so they were living in a new place, which had in many ways similar rules, but also was very different culturally from area to area in China. So they got to learn about each other through this piggybacking, local to local piggybacking process. We did all meet. The cool thing about this actual project was we actually did all meet back in the classroom in the mornings. So they would do their project and then we would come back and meet in the classrooms and talk about what they learned culturally, what they learned about art and about art making and about communicating what others do or ideas that they have. And so it was really functional in that way. So just to sum it up, I guess there's some takeaways that I would love for you to have. One is, I've kind of run out of time here, so I'm gonna just kind of lay it all out for you. So one is that piggybacking is geared toward using everyday technology. It bridges remote and on-site participants in teaching and learning. It fosters collaboration in creative and cultural learning as a form of inquiry. Like Joana mentioned earlier, it's very fluid. It's not, it does have its ambiguous moments, but it also has really concrete learning that students retain. It fosters collaboration in creative and cultural learning as a form of inquiry, and it's faculty-led, but it's also student-driven based on interest. So I think that that's the summary share. So if there are any questions, please don't hesitate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell and Dr. Hyatt, for this wonderful presentation. I took down a couple of notes. I think there's so much richness in all of the content. So thank you so much for sharing all of the process and the experience and the goals that you have with this piggybacking project. I do have a couple of questions that I would love to share with you today and would love your insight. Hopefully we get some time to answer all of them because they're really great. What are some low-cost technologies to create virtual exchanges?
From my point of view, the best low-cost technology is a phone. For example, Cricket has a smartphone that's $50, and if you can get so in low income areas, it's often just a matter of really writing grants or getting donors. For example, in Guatemala, you can get something as simple as WhatsApp and have, even if you can't have the video dialogue happening, we had the audio dialogue happening. So they could hear what people were saying and how they were engaging. And people would describe it, like almost like someone, there was one student who would describe things as if the people who were in the audio room could visualize. And then also pictures, because sometimes it was just sending pictures. So there's a lot of ways to compensate for that. But in my opinion, everybody has a cell phone, you know, and why not use it for education practice?
Yeah, and following up with Dr. Powell, I want to add to that. Because of the COVID-19, some of my students did not have laptops at home. And some of them didn't have access to Wi-Fi. So they turned in many of their assignments through their cell phones, and they were very creative in how they reached those goals. Remember, we talked about how some students will not reach certain objectives or outcomes, but they'll just do it in a different way. And so again, like Dr. Powell mentioned, she used her cell phone. She used sidewalk chalk to outline a layout of a classroom and where specifically she was going to stage different activities in her classroom. All it took was her phone, and her cell phone and sidewalk chalk. And she was able to meet the objectives of a very complex assignment. So I think Dr. Powell is correct. The cell phone and using certain inexpensive apps or free apps is the way to go. I know we used, in virtual exchange, we used Flipgrid and several other technologies that allow for uploading video and free. All of the resources and applications were free.
Yeah, there are several that we incorporate in, and Flipgrid, Padlet, Wix, for those who do have computers. But I think the main thing is really to engage in learning with what students have available to them and be willing to adjust and adapt in that process.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. We have one question coming in through the chat. I would encourage any and all participants that if they have any questions or comments, please drop them in the chat box so we can incorporate it into this Q&A. We have the following question. Could we say that piggybacking is about making different classrooms around different places, only the students with one teacher at a distance? So I believe that what they're asking is different classroom for the students, or for different students, but with one singular teacher that will teach a particular goal or class.
So in other words, so I'm trying to be clear. So can it just be done with one instructor is what you're saying?
I believe that's what the participant is asking.
Yeah, and actually what I think is even better, though, in truth, is when you give a student a prompt or an objective, or you articulate the objectives that you want them to accomplish within a learning process. If you designate students will rise to the occasion, and they will take the lead on students in that process. So the burden doesn't always have to live on sole faculty or instructor. For example, when I was in China, I was the only instructor, and I had a group of 40 students, undergraduate students, who we were engaging with. And I think that, I could have, in some ways, you think, oh my gosh, that's so many, right in the classroom, and they're all doing, but I had to rely on the students themselves. And I think that we need to make sure we give ourselves that leeway. It does not mean we don't moderate. It does not mean we don't assess. It does not mean that we're not looking for learning. We are, but it's really important to acknowledge that students are willing to take responsibility for the goals that you give them if you allow them to do that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. We have another question, which is, how do you manage the light saving changes, or like when you have different time zones that are participating on one particular activity?
So that's a good question. And Joanna and I actually, we had a bit of a struggle with this, but then we kind of outlined. So one of the other things, you mentioned Flipgrid. So one of the other things, well, also, when I go to certain countries, for example, in China, it was local to local, so we were all in the same time zone. In Guatemala, there isn't that big of a difference in time zones. I solely teach online, so asking students to log in at a specific time to engage wasn't really an issue. However, when Joanna and I planned to do virtual exchange for Israel to Lamar, it became kind of challenging. And so what we decided to do was we would use, in the times that we couldn't meet at the same time that her class was actually meeting face-to-face, that we would use Flipgrid, where students would ask questions, where the students, like graduate students, could post Flipgrid video, and it's just like almost like a Snapchat of sorts, but it's a Flipgrid video. And what Flipgrid does is it allows other students to respond to what they're saying, if that makes sense. So we were looking at other technologies. The other one that kind of compensated for that time difference was Padlet. And it's more of a poster kind of app that's really cool. You can post images, or you can post writing little notes on there, and people can respond to your notes and respond to what you're doing. So they had those frameworks as kind of a call and response to what was happening in the learning cycle. So I think that that's, for us, that was one way of compensating. And I think probably because our discipline is art and it's creative and it's more fluid, and we're looking at process, we're looking at culture, we're looking at strategies for retention. I think that's what made it really good to use specifically those two apps in process, in planning.
I would also add to that with Heidi. When we were going to teach, I was going to teach the course in Texas, and we were going to piggyback with Dr. Powell and her students to Israel. There was a time difference, right? A huge time difference. So I had the students download the world clock so that they could see what time it was in Israel. Understanding that even though our class time was set for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Israel is 8 hours ahead. So that means it would be 10 o'clock at night for those students. So that's very difficult to try and begin and engage in assignments or conversations when they're over in Israel and they're getting ready to wind things down. So we had to do this and schedule it outside of the class time. So it's really important to consider those time zones. I mean, that's one thing that we can't change. So we have to be flexible in the way we approach it. And believe it or not, I think because of the pandemic, we have become much more flexible as instructors. We're saying our students may not be able to meet us during this particular time to this particular time, because many of them are childcare, they're being called to work. Because their employers know that they don't, they're not at school, so they're being called in as essential workers. So as instructors, we've had to be much more flexible about when we meet for class. And we've also been better at recording sessions. So for those students who can't make it, they can view the recording and meet with their partners at any time that's convenient for them.
That is amazing and super practical. Thank you for giving us, I love those tips as to how to manage all of that. So we have only like a few more minutes, but I definitely have some amazing questions that I would love to get your feedback on that. One of the participants asked, what amount of time, so like between minutes or like hours, do you recommend for doing these activities, and how do you manage to keep the attention span of the students, throughout the whole class course? We know that the screen sometimes can create some fatigue, so I wonder, how do you balance the learning experience, attention span, and also all of these virtual spaces that we have to engage in consistently?
I think that actually, and Joana can add to this too, for example, in China, it's local to local. They're only required to piggyback for 30 minutes. And they're looking for specific things in that piggybacking process that have been outlined and articulated for them. For longer process or longer projects, for example, Guatemala making an alfombra, looking, I call it kind of intermittent joining, because you're correct, fatigue does get kind of crazy. I actually have another faculty currently who's developed this way of doing home studios, and he augmented even that. It's not that it was my idea, I just chose to do it that way, but he's actually applied it in a studio setting where he has students join him intermittently. And I think that that I would recommend that, and because you have them sign on at a specific time, you're going to do a specific task, then they get to go do that task and finish it out. And if they want to stay online with another student to talk it out and to work through the process, they can. But and that's when you really look at kind of this, it's actually a public school term called think, pair, share. And it's something we use actually in elementary education a lot, where if you put them in think, pair, share, then if the actual time for piggybacking is done, they can stay together and work on whatever they want to work on, or they can disconnect and work on it and then come back together. I don't know if that helps or not, but.
Yeah, and I agree, Dr. Powell. I think that, like you said, for art, we use it for different purposes. Like I have a webcam that toggles between me speaking and then it shows what I'm painting. So when I'm doing my demonstrations for my students and we're working together in watercolor, they're, they may be with me. For those students who are advanced in watercolor and they've got the idea of what they want to create, they're not required to stay on. So that flexibility again, when you're planning your objectives and your outcomes, it's incredibly important to allow students to have that flexibility. Sure, you should have some required meetings, but at like required critiques, required, class times to meet with your partners. But outside of that, I think we, again, have to be incredibly flexible on how we allow students to engage with us online.
Yes, that is super helpful. Thank you so much for sharing all of those different ways of managing. So we only have 3 more minutes before the presentation finishes, but I have 2 more topics that I would love to discuss with both of you. So the first of all would be, how can we be inclusive when it comes to the learning competencies that we try to develop through piggybacking? And how would you suggest for us in the Dominican Republic to take advantage of this program as much as we can, especially since we're looking at different ways to have our students learn and being able to develop as young professionals?
I think you always have to start out with assessment. And when I mean assessment, I'm not talking about measuring learning objectives. I'm talking about assessing the needs of the community that you want to reach. I think that without that and without doing the initial assessment, it's going to be very difficult, because you don't want to give someone something they don't need, and you don't want to deny someone something they need. So it's assess the community that you're trying to reach, to see what their needs are, how you can help them. I know that Joana and I have, we have worked toward making sure certain students have certain things that they might not have had if we didn't have intervention. And I think that is the responsibility in some ways of the educator, with the support of administration or other institutions or organizations that are working, whether it's NGOs or other things like that. So it's really important. First thing, assess the community you want to reach, because you need to know who wants to be a part of what you're doing. Because some people, like students, our students don't get a choice. They've enrolled in the class and they have to do it. They have to figure out where they're going to get that Nokia phone, or figure out where, you know, if they have a computer to be online. But when you have low income and things that aren't so accessible, it's very important to make a needs assessment to the students that you are going to serve in that process. The second question you asked about, I don't know, Joana, add to that, and then I'm going to think about Alejandra's second question.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, as an educator, I've learned not to have preconceived notions about what the students' final projects will look like, because each time they surprise me with their ingenuity and their innovation. Just like the student who took the sidewalk chalk on her cell phone and really rocked it. I mean, she hit every single objective of that assignment and did it with the bare minimum. So sometimes constraints can be creative. And there are certain people like artists and writers and other educators. Anyone has the potential to be creative. And so sometimes those constraints can bring out that creativity. So I have learned to let go of any preconceived notions of what I think the final project should look like. And virtual exchange lends itself to that. Because each project, collaborative project that the students work on will be different. No two will be the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and ask me the second part of that question, Alejandra.
The second part of the question was, how can we in the Dominican Republic take advantage of the resources that piggybacking, right, of these virtual exchanges can provide to our students and young professionals?
So I think that, first of all, just because, and I don't want to say just because we are art educators, but just because we're talking about this in the frame of art education doesn't mean it solely applies to art education. You can train people through piggybacking, like for, you know, some of the tenets and some of the things for the U.S. Embassy are security and disaster preparedness. You could actually take people piggybacking through those processes. We talked kind of a day or two ago about, you know, how do you get medical practitioners involved? So it's not limited to content. It just so happens we're art educators. We love the arts, but it's not limited in that capacity. So I think that you have to look in the lens of what you're trying to accomplish within the domain that you're trying to accomplish it. And then you can use it for training, you can use it for education, you can use it for real world practice. So in the DR, that's what I would look at, you know, training, understanding schooling, public schooling for sure, and learning, but it's not limited to one discipline. Just because I presented piggybacking as an art education tool doesn't mean it's limited to art education. It actually means that it's not limited to that, and you adapt it accordingly but understanding that you're looking at real world learning and how can you get people to learn through engagement in that process. And I can tell you, you know, it's almost like, I don't want to say photographers who go on reality shows to film people, but it's kind of feels like that sometimes. And you're going along and you're engrossed in what's happening because you're right there because they're showing you what's happening. And it actually lends itself to more engagement in truth. So I hope I answered that question well, but mainly it's not limited. How, you know, the DR I think would benefit solely even by this topic alone and the strategies it uses outside of art education to engage people in the everyday place, and they can join in and learning even when they're not in a specific place.
Well, that answers the question perfectly, and I think it's a way of putting ourselves in other people's shoes. Instead, this time we're putting ourselves in other people's screens. But I think that is a fantastic resource. Thank you, both of you, for being with us and sharing your knowledge, your experience. I personally feel extremely inspired after listening as to all of the different ways in which we can use this resource, that we can also challenge ourselves, our students, our coworkers, our family members, everyone around us to be able to engage with learning in a different way from what we've been traditionally taught to engage with. So I wanted to, again, thank you, both of you, for this amazing experience. I just wanted to ask you if anyone has any other questions or has interest in the whole piggybacking process, how could they reach you?
So it's on the screen. Both Joanna and I, it would be good if you emailed us both together. So you get, what I love about working with Joanna and what she loves about working with me is that we often come with two different points of view. And then we really kind of, it offers us even more diverse opportunity because we come together with two different points of view. So our emails are right here on the screen for you to email us. We're happy to share our knowledge and what we are doing within the context of teaching and learning, especially, and also in global contexts and real-time project-based learning. So with curricular constraints, because they do have curricular constraints.
Well, there you go, everyone. If you have any further questions, which I'm pretty sure you all do, don't hesitate to reach our panelists to their email addresses. And yeah, I hope you all feel safe and during these current times. And yeah, to also thank you all for taking out the time to engage with these different opportunities, and to the U.S. Embassy, and to Dr. Hyatt and Dr. Powell for sharing this space with all of you, with all of us.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank
and thank you for
you.
the opportunity to share what we're doing.